Hello again, everyone. I'm Eric Anderson, and on behalf of the entire Atlantic Data Security team, but especially the engineering team, I'd like to welcome you to another Support Aware instructional webinar. As a quick reminder for all of you, Support Aware is our proprietary offering where we try ultimately to help you get the most value possible out of your product investment, whether it's through analysis and assessment services, working with you to help monitor or to upgrade your version, say from whatever you're on to R80.20 to take advantage of the things we'll talk about today. Our goal, again, is just to work more interactively with you, to put you in a better place and solve problems, answer questions, whatever we can do to help. So make sure that you're aware that you have these services, leverage our team, keep us busy. Sad thing to have bored engineers sitting on the bench. So definitely engage us and let us help you get the value you deserve out of your investment in products, especially around Checkpoint. One of the other things we try to do is further education. And part of the support we're offering is webinars such as this. The intent is to be educational. We want you to understand what you've got, how to use it, and try and aid you in your day-to-day lives. And through some of the things I'm going to show today, that's what we try to do for 80.20. Again, I'm not trying to sell you anything as much as it may sound like I'm trying to push 80.20. You already own it. We're not selling it to you. You have it. I just want you to understand some of the cool little things that it does for you. I'm not here to sell anything. I'm not going to pitch anything. If I do, it'll really only be on this slide here where I want to talk about some upcoming events. For those of you who think you know how to play poker, got a great poker face. At the end of January, I think on the 30th here in Boston, we are having a cybersecurity symposium and poker tournament. If you're in the area, definitely come give it a shot, learn something, and maybe win something. We should be doing that again, I believe, at the end of February. I apologize to marketing if I'm incorrect there, but in the Rochester area. And of course, in February also is Checkpoint's annual CPX 360 event. It's a multi-day immersive experience, and that's actually its former name was the Checkpoint Experience. Happening again this year in Vegas. Speakers and presenters, including yours truly, from all around the world, talking about different aspects of Checkpoint and other related topics that tie in somehow to Checkpoint. And should be a very good time, very informative, and hopefully we'll see you there. We also, of course, have our upcoming class schedule available on our website, as are all the event listings and so forth. So definitely check it out. You've likely also recently received a newsletter. Information is there, and you can always reach out to us to ask any questions or inquire as to what's coming up. But with that, let's move on to the agenda for the day. I'm going to start off with a brief review of the lifespan of R80 to kind of put in perspective where it started and where we've gone from there and when. I'm going to touch very, very briefly on some of the things that Checkpoint is very proud of, and you likely know they're very proud of because you see it splashed all over the place, whether it's in email, on LinkedIn, on their own website. All the marketing materials from Checkpoint are promoting some very exciting, interesting advancements and features, but those aren't what I'm going to linger on. There's plenty of information out there. They're covered in depth. I'm going to jump very quickly into the things that I've found through working with clients and working with our other engineers, things that we've seen that R80 introduces or adds that I think are actually tangibly useful. They're not as exciting, not as sexy, but I think from my angle, from as an instructor and as an engineer, they are almost more immediately useful. So we'll spend some time on those. Being a live re-recording, full disclosure, of a webinar that was done earlier in this week, we will not have live Q&A, but I will try and work in answers to those questions that did come up at the end of the live session. So we will try and still answer the questions that were asked, but again, feel free to reach out to me directly, to our engineering team, to support and ask us any questions you have. We want to help get you answers. So, R80. Seemed strange to me when I was putting this together that it was actually almost 3 years ago that R80 was first introduced. It was a big deal. For those that remember or that were around before R80, the big major change with R80 was the introduction of a true relational database on the management server, replacing the text files that were loosely referred to as a database before. It was, because of that massive overhaul, a management-only release. There was no new gateway code to go with R80. Of course, backward compatibility still allowed us to manage our previous versions of gateways, but there was no new gateway code. So a lot of the neat new features that R80 could introduce wouldn't actually be usable until we got to R80.10. That was actually in Q2 of last year, of 2017. This was a release that included both management and gateway upgrades. The management upgrades were not as significant, definitely some tweaks, some fixes, and enhancements. But now we had gateway code to help us leverage all the cool new things that R80 introduced besides the database. Things like layering in our policies. That was a really big introduction, and that kind of spawned more migrations or upgrades to 80.10. Through 2016, what we saw mostly were people that were new adopters of Checkpoint or deploying new Checkpoint setups, that we would do R80 for management and 77 dot whatever for gateways. But now in Q2 of 2017, with 80.10 having the gateway version as well, we saw much more adoption and upgrade. Motivation was there because the new gateway features were compelling enough. In Q2 of this year, 2018, there was a release of R80.20.M1, the M standing for management. It was a management-only release to introduce some of the new things that we were going to see in 8020, but to do it before gateway code was ready. At the time, the announcement was that we were going to have two different tracks. When Checkpoint released management, it would have a .M, gateway would have a .G, and they could go on separate release schedules. Whether that might still be the plan, I don't know, but it seems to have backed off because in Q3 of this year, R80.20, with no extension after that, was released. And this is true R80.20 for management and for gateways. And that's where we're at today. And again, new features. Checkpoint likes to talk about how there are 100 plus new features, significant performance gains in many aspects, including HTTPS inspection, which we're going to talk about a little bit more today. They've done a lot within their AI. They've done enhancements on the cloud aspects, especially CloudGuard. There are large differences. Things like ICAP, both server and client capabilities built in. They've enhanced threat prevention to be able to use layering the way we do in our security policies, leveraging both multiple layers and sharing of layers. So some really interesting things that are going on. A lot of these things, and of the the 90 plus others that I didn't mention, you can get plenty of information about directly from Checkpoint. One of the other things I want to update everyone on is the end of support. In our last session, last quarter, we talked about how they were going end of support for R77.30 in, I believe it was March or May. Would have been either way. Early next year. They've extended that for a couple of reasons. One is just for many larger organizations, the timing was a little bit too short. They need a little more to get up to 70 to get off of 7730. Also, some with custom hotfixes and patches need a little more time. So they've extended that support officially. I don't want anyone to delay that much. 80.20 has been, since we've begun testing, actually testing earlier with EA in our own labs, pretty solid, pretty tight. I don't love to strongly recommend anyone be on the latest and greatest unless there are compelling features that you need. What you want to do is be on a stable release. 80.10 is incredibly stable. We've seen some very good things. Don't hold me to that. I'm knocking on wood here. But it's been a very solid release. And I would say at this point, the majority of our customers are probably using 80.20 for at least management, if not a large number or most of their gateways. Sorry. I said 80.20, I meant 80.10. 80.20, though, is not something we're shying away from. Most new deployments, especially the last month or two, we are working with 80.20. So don't hesitate. Don't delay things till September. Definitely get on a path. Work with our engineers. Work with Support Aware to get yourself up to 80.20. So what's new? What things have actually changed? I want to start off with one that has received some improvements. It's not night and day. It's not a major overhaul to SmartView, but I want to make sure I mention it because I find that too many are unaware that SmartView even exists. What SmartView basically is a web-based, purely browser-based view into your logs and reports and views. Everything that you see in Smart Console in the Log and Monitor tab section, all of that is available via browser only. This can be very useful for yourself if you're using occasionally, let's say, a Chromebook or a Mac or something that you can't run native Smart Console on, or especially for those people who we don't want to install Smart Console on, that are maybe doing occasionally monitoring, like a knock or a SOC. We want to give them access into logs. We want to give them access to views, but they have no need or desire to touch policy or anything else that Smart Console offers. So we can give them a simple view via browser. The same credentials will be used. When they go to log in, it's going to give them the same page or same simple look that we have when we log in with Smart Console, asking for a name and a password. Of course, it doesn't have to prompt them for the IP address because that's what we've used to access the site in the first place. Once they've logged in, again, we see the same types of views and logs that we have in Smart Console. This is purely captured from within a browser. What they've done to enhance this in 8020, added some new things like the cyber attack view, which is really pretty cool. Of course, in demo mode here, we don't actually have anything interesting going on, so it looks pretty boring, but that's really what you'd want to see anyway, is a whole bunch of zeros here. But if there were attacks or other things that had happened, it's a nice little summary. And that is one of the things new in 80.20. I'm just showing it from within SmartView. SmartView's also enhanced the log viewing itself and done little things. For example, adding a refresh button or an auto refresh button, which wasn't there before. So it's definitely continued to advance. I want everyone to make sure that you're aware that SmartView exists. Take a look at it. If you're running 80.something, your management server has this, and it likely has it already enabled. I think the only time it might not be enabled by default is if the management server was running on very limited RAM. But simply go to HTTPS with the IP or resolvable name of your management server /SmartView, and you should be able to see all of this. It's very cool, definitely worth a look. The next one I want to mention is maybe somewhat selfish of me because I'm a keyboard guy. I go back to the DOS days, and I'm aging myself, but I grew up, in computing with a keyboard before mice really existed. And I've still found that if I can do it with a keyboard, I'd prefer to do it with a keyboard. It just is faster. I don't have to look at it. I don't have to look at a cursor. I can just kind of fly across a keyboard. Well, with 80.20, Checkpoint's introduced much more significant keyboard utilization. To demonstrate this, however, I do have to go into a live demo. Wouldn't really be that much proof to show you doing this stuff from static slides. So if I were in Smart Console as I am now, and let's say I had a bunch of users that I wanted to reset their passwords. We're all familiar, hopefully, with the Objects Explorer. And I will use the mouse here just to show you one way to see these shortcuts. If I hover over the Objects Explorer icon over here on the right, it shows me that Control-E is a simple keystroke to bring up the Objects Explorer. I'm going to put the mouse away again. I'm going to use it again in a second just to show you another reference like that. But when I hit Control-E, trust me, I'm only keyboard now. I'll leave the cursor there so you can see it. I brought up the Objects Explorer. Now using the Tab key, I can go down to my categories listing. Whoops. Over to my categories listing. And I can select users. And when I find the users I want and I hit space, now I'm limiting my view on the right to the users category. If I tab over and open up an individual user, hit enter, I can go down to authentication, hit tab a couple of times, hit space on the new password, and I can give Tony a new password. Hit tab a couple more times, hit enter on OK. I've just changed Tony's password without moving or even touching the mouse. I can then close that window. Let's say I want to look at the policy. And here again, I'm going to use the mouse just to show you the clue here. If I want to go to security policies, hitting Control-2 will get me to that second tab. Of course, if I want to look at logs and monitors, you can probably guess it's Control-3, and that'll get me down to that tab. But if I move my cursor back over here and hit Control-2, now I'm looking at my policy. If I tab over, another interesting little hint, if I want to modify Rule 6, I can actually hit Control-G, ask me for a rule number, and I can type Rule 6 and enter. And look at that. I've now highlighted Rule 6, and I can move my cursor around to get to different cells. I can move between rules all around my policy with my cursor keys. If I want to add a destination to Rule 6, once I've got that cell highlighted, I can hit either the spacebar or the plus key, and it brings up my object picker. Here I can say add, you have to spell things right. It doesn't automatically spell for you. I could add the Exchange server to that cell as well. And I can continue on and move on. If I then want to modify something within a cell, if I hit enter, my cursor is inside the cell, and I can then delete that server as well. It sounds simple, but eventually, the more you do this and the more you mess around with policies, it can become very helpful and very time-saving. So I do like to to show that, make sure everyone's aware that keyboard can do a lot for you. There's actually other lists of additional hotkeys and other keystrokes, and it is evolving. I've been told that Checkpoint is going to be releasing an SK on this with a mapping of all the new keystrokes. I will also minimize this now using the keyboard and go back to our presentation. 8020 has also introduced a couple new types of objects. I'm actually going to cover 3 of them in the next few sections here. The first one I find kind of interesting. It's called a wildcard object. And for a scenario here, let's look at the idea that maybe we have a big core switch or a bunch of core switches in our environment with a whole bunch of different VLANs and subnets on them, and we have IP addresses for the switch on every subnet. That's what traffic is being routed to, and ultimately, let's say it's .254 on each of our subnets is actually a switch IP address. The only way to reference all of those IP addresses today is through individual host objects. We could then put all those host objects into a group object, but the problem is they're non-sequential. Traditionally, we have for our network objects, we've got our hosts, our networks, or even our address ranges, but those all cover consecutive or concurrent series of IP addresses. Wildcard objects allow us to go a little bit differently and say, I want every IP address that has a 192.168.0.254. Now, what does that .0 mean? Well, 0 in this case is our wildcard. Now, it's not traditional asterisk and question mark wildcards. It's a net mask wildcard. So what we've done is down below in the second section there, we've added 00255.0 to say that that third octet can effectively be anything. So in the IP address above, the 0 is effectively what we've masked off and made a wildcard. You don't have to use 255. You can mask off any individual octet with a smaller range as well. If we only wanted to include, let's say, 0 through 128 or 0 through 127, we could have masked that with a different value there. And it gets into all the subnet masking math, but you'll get the idea that you have a very flexible range or way of dictating a range of IP addresses within any octet, but then specifying all of the others. So this group would again now include 254 different specific IP addresses of switches. Kind of a neat idea. And then these become useful in your policy anywhere you would use another network or host type object, source, destination, up to you. Neat idea. Another one that I think has been a longer time coming and been asked for quite a bit is what they call updatable objects. In the scenario here, let's say you wanted to allow access to Microsoft services like hosted Exchange, or maybe AWS, or file hosting within the Amazon infrastructure. Ways of doing that outside of application control. And application control can offer some of this. When we talk about identifying the specific applications, yeah, but we typically want to do this by destination. I'd love to be able to put a destination object that has all of the IP addresses used by Microsoft or Amazon for whichever services we're talking about. To do that has been very, very difficult, unwieldy, or arguably impossible by setting up individual host objects for every one of those IP addresses. Just very, very impractical at the very least. Well, updatable objects are the answer to that. And Checkpoint has introduced these in 80.20, and you'll see some examples of them here. The idea is that these are services and offerings that Checkpoint will constantly be updating through partnership with those providers. And it's broken down into very specific applications or even into regions as you look at updatable objects. They go in, again, in a destination, in a rule, typically where any other host object would go. But they ultimately resolve back to IP addresses. You just don't have to worry about what they are. When defining them, again, you'll see various examples here. I just went a little bit deeper with other examples where within Amazon, for example, you have regions, and you can say, we only allow Amazon East, or we only use Amazon East servers. And you could specifically put those objects in, and now you don't have to worry about the IPs. They'll be constantly updated by Checkpoint and leveraged within your policy without affecting performance. And that's one of the big caveats. In previous versions, there were domain objects and other types of dynamic objects, but they were typically very negative because they had significant impacts on performance. These do not. These are much more streamlined and much more capable. So definitely something worth taking a look at in R80.20. And the last type of new object I'd like to introduce is called a syslog server. And this goes at an issue we've seen over many, many years where customers want to be able to get logs somewhere outside of Checkpoint. And typically you can do that via syslog. Now, there are other ways as well. When you're using significant higher-end systems like a QRadar, for example, they do tie into Checkpoint as an OPSEC partner using SICK and can use Checkpoint's LEA for their log export API and allow Checkpoint allows that provider to be able to pull logs out of Checkpoint or deliver logs from Checkpoint to them securely. But Checkpoint has always been hesitant and very reluctant to embrace the idea of syslog, mostly because they found it very insecure. It is, but so are so many other protocols that we use and live by. There have been ways, typically on your log servers or on your management servers, to export or extract your logs and get them out of Checkpoint and into something else. They're often seen as kind of workarounds or hacks to get that data that Checkpoint doesn't want us to get. That said, there are also other options from Checkpoint. And the log exporter from Checkpoint is a very viable option for doing that. It's been around in different forms for a while. So Checkpoint does have valid ways of getting logs from your log servers out and onto other systems. But the new object they're talking about is a little bit different. This new syslog server object you create just like you would any other type of server object. But it is specifically intended for syslogs, and it shows up effectively as a log server. When you create the object, Checkpoint, of course, loves to give you this little note that says, these are bad. This is a bad idea. Syslog is insecure. Don't use it unless you're aware of that and you've got the communication going over a secure network, in which case, of course, who cares? If the syslog server is sitting right next to the firewall on a dedicated interface, you have no security issues here. They just want to make sure you're aware. We ignore or heed the warning and continue on. We're allowed to create this object, and I called it Kiwi Server, and that's the product I was using for my syslog server. Simply create the object, referencing a host object, which has the IP address on it, of course, and set it to use syslog. Once I've done that, now that object becomes available to me in my gateway configuration. And the screen we're looking at here is a gateway config page under the log section. The Kiwi server simply shows up as another viable log destination, just like my existing management server does. And that's what's unique about this method. The gateway itself will deliver logs directly via syslog to that server. It doesn't have to hit the management server. It still can. I could be logging to multiple destinations, but the unique new piece of this is that the gateways can deliver logs directly to a syslog server. Kind of a cool idea. And here we have my syslog server being populated with some generic logs from a gateway. The next one is one for our MDS friends. For those running multi-domain server, I'll make this pretty quick for those who aren't. One of the really cool, neat little features that I haven't seen a lot about, but I found buried in there somewhere, was the idea of scheduling policy installs. Now, for those who don't have MDS, this is something I'd like to think will eventually trickle down to the rest of us and allow us to do the exact same thing. But what the goal is here, especially for those using MDS with large numbers of gateways and large numbers of policies, in this installed policy presets section in MDS, in the multi-domain management, you'll see we can simply add items to do policy installs, either one-off and say, you know what, I want this policy to go at 10:30 tonight, or even on a regular basis. We can say we have a regular policy install window, and at midnight every Wednesday, we have these policies install. And the policies can be specified either by policy names themselves, and then specify the targets, or by gateway, and say install this gateway's policy again at this time. Again, they can be one time, they can be recurring, either weekly, nightly, whatever you'd like, and it becomes a very simple, scheduled process. It sounds a little scary, and most of us like to, especially when we have a more manageable number of gateways, like to do the installs and keep an eye on things and make sure nobody screams. But when you have these processes where someone right now is manually going in and going through a list of 20 different policy installs on that scheduled basis, why not let the server help you? And that's what the scheduled installation allows for. Again, I like to think that hopefully eventually this comes down for those of us without MDS, but it's more of an important issue for those with those large enterprise installs anyway. So it's kind of an interesting aspect and definitely worth taking a look at within MDS once you're up to 80.20. And that, again, of course, is now a management-only function. You do not need to upgrade gateways to be able to take advantage of this. I will jump back and say the syslog feature. That, of course, does require the gateways to be using 80.20 as well, as do the other object types. The gateways wouldn't understand anything about them if all you had done was upgrade the management server. Another one, and this is one that I've been waiting for Checkpoint to do forever, and this comes from the issue where topology, historically, has been a little confusing. Way back when, primarily to deal with anti-spoofing, Checkpoint introduced a method of defining topology on an interface that allows, or really requires us to tell Checkpoint what IP addresses are connected to a particular NIC. We do this again so that anti-spoofing knows what's valid and what isn't. Simple if we have a basic topology where every interface is connected to one network. But when we have an interface that's connected to a switch or to router or routers that have other networks out there, it becomes a little more complicated. And the typical way to deal with this is, as you see in the middle there, specifying a group that contains all of those internal networks that are connected to this particular interface. Now anti-spoofing knows that every one of those IP addresses is potentially valid as a source IP when it comes in through this NIC. Without doing that, anti-spoofing blocks all that traffic that comes from unknown IP addresses. Also adding this to our VPN domain by default. If our VPN domain is specified as all internal interfaces and their networks, these networks become part of our VPN domain as well. Nice and simple. We've also always had to deal with routing, because for every one of those networks that's connected to a specific switch, we have to define static routes to make sure the replies are going back the correct direction. So very often the routes are defined correctly. Everybody understands and adds the routes into Gaia, but this piece doesn't get updated. And we end up with calls coming in with questions and problems because traffic is getting dropped from a new VLAN that was turned on. Making sure that it's added to this group as well is the solution. Well, because there's always been that mapping or that similarity between the routing table and the topology, Checkpoint has finally added this option to define and dynamically update your topology definition based on the routing table. And this is, for me, as someone who has worked countless times with customers to clean up their topology definitions to deal with spoofing, this is a huge one, because as long as we've got the routes defined correctly in Gaia, now the topology is going to be correct as well, because it'll pull that routing information. And in another not so common but interesting example, and I talk about this in the training courses, it is possible to create a Gaia administrative account with very limited privileges, for example, only to the static routing configuration, and let the infrastructure team that works on our switches and our routers and lights up all those new VLANs all the time, allow them access into the firewall's operating system to manipulate the routing table and add routes when they need to. If we've done that and we're letting them take care of our routing, they're also effectively taking care of our topology as well, because this is coming from routing. Very cool idea. This is also incredibly useful with dynamic routing. If you have specific networks that are moving around, and one day might be routed out this interface, but then tomorrow the best path is to go out a different interface, that interface topology is updated automatically. Very cool feature, has a lot of potential to make life easier down the road. When we look at that interface again, now it shows that its topology is simply defined by routes. And last but not least, one of those very, very interesting topics for most is HTTPS inspection. It brings up pain points, and I'm sure I see a lot of cringing as I look back through the webcam and see all of you. It is definitely something we all have to be cognizant of and be aware of and have to move towards, and that's simply because the internet is moving to HTTPS. It's both a good and a bad thing. For the end user, it's a great idea. We're going to encrypt our data between our client and the server, between our browser and the server. And I'm not going to let myself get sucked into a whole explanation of what HTTPS inspection is. I'm happy to speak with any of you offline about it. Definitely reach out if you want to talk about it more. We're happy to work with you. Again, that's part of what we do with Support Aware. But one of the problems has been, for those deploying HTTPS inspection, let's say we already have a really nice URL filtering policy. We've got it working. It's blocking inappropriate sites. We've done some good work on this to make sure that people are only allowed to use the services and the sites that they should. And that's great. It works wonderfully without HTTPS inspection. Well, what about the HTTPS sites? What if somebody's going to go to Facebook and it's going to be SSL encrypted? There has been an option to categorize HTTPS traffic. What this categorization does is it doesn't do the whole man-in-the-middle HTTPS decrypt thing. Instead, it monitors the certificate exchange and pulls the DN out of that and uses the name in that DN to do our URL filtering categorization. Because we know the site you're exchanging certificates with, we can look up what category it's in and apply that policy based on that information. So it's not HTTPS inspection. It doesn't break anything that way. It just tries to add some value and allow us to apply our policy on that traffic. And that's been a good thing as well. The problem we've run into is when users go and then configure HTTPS inspection. One of the simple solutions when you first do this, because things will break. There are certain sites that won't work or that we don't want to inspect. So we have this policy for HTTPS inspection that we develop to help make sure that we're doing it properly, that we're bypassing inspection for either sites that we don't need to inspect, that we shouldn't inspect for legal reasons and compliance reasons, or that just don't work well if we do the typical inspection. But when we deploy this policy, when we turn on HTTPS inspection initially, it's going to take time to get that policy right. There's going to be a testing phase or a pilot phase. So what we typically want to do is reduce the impact by limiting the exposure to a subset of our users. Whether it's a cybersecurity team and a testing group, we want to say only these people will get inspected until we've worked out all the kinks. So we'll typically do that with a rule at the top. It's one place I like to use negates because it does make things a little more streamlined. Everything after rule 1 will eventually be our policy, because I've said in rule 1, only if the traffic is not coming from those two test groups, we get to bypass right at the top. Rule 1 says, okay, you're out of here. We're not going to inspect you. But then for those test groups, we continue down and do follow our policy to see what's bypassed and what's inspected. Well, the problem users have run into is throughout the past, you put this policy in, rule 1 is going to bypass your traffic. You could even write it another way that says all internal users get bypassed, and above it have a rule for who gets inspected. But however you're doing this, you put this policy in, and it looks like HTTPS inspection is going to be bypassed for everyone. You enable it, and everyone's web traffic is negatively affected. All of a sudden, your users are complaining they can't get to sites. They're being bypassed. HTTPS inspection is not active on them. The problem has been, once you enable HTTPS inspection, categorization is disabled. It's been either or, one or the other. So now that we're not categorizing their HTTPS traffic, our URL filtering policy, depending on how it's architected and the logic used in the rules, may just be dropping that traffic because it can't identify that they're going somewhere that they should be allowed to. So it's failing closed and they're being denied. It's been a big issue, and it's been a source of confusion because it's not very obvious that turning on HTTPS inspection effectively disables categorization. But it's happening. And it frustrates people because now HTTPS inspection seems like it's breaking everything, when really it's just the dependence on categorization has made it so that we can't absorb losing it. Well, the good news is, and I'm trying to get to the good news quickly here, the good news is 80/20 allows you to use both. So now in 80.20, again, it has to be on the gateways. Once we've enabled HTTPS inspection, we haven't lost categorization. So even if we're bypassing our HTTPS inspection for a large number of people, we can still categorize their traffic based on the cert exchanges and apply our URL filtering policy appropriately. And that is potentially huge. It opens up a whole new world for those who've had issues and failures in the past deploying HTTPS inspection. I've just seen it far too many times that that was the reason. Now it doesn't have to be. So I definitely urge everyone to look at it again. Again, leverage us for help. That's what we're here for. I'd also be very curious, if you were here live to ask questions, what you've seen in 80/20 that you find interesting, if you have gone there yet, what interesting things you've learned and found. Definitely let us know. Keep in touch. You can reach out to me directly. I'll throw my information up in a second. But you can, of course, reach out to our entire support team as well through whatever channels you normally do. I'd also love personally to learn what you'd like to see in the future for other sessions. We still have to come up with our topic for our Q1 session next year. My guess is it will likely have to do with fallout from CPX 360, what we've learned at CPX 360, other new things that have been introduced. So I would expect that it'll probably be hopefully in early March, our next session, and will be related to that information. But I'm not guaranteeing that. I would love to hear requests, what things you find interesting, what you'd like to see a session on, what you think others might as well. If a whole bunch of you send the same idea, that's what we're going to talk about. So definitely keep in touch, interact with us, and have a great new year. Have a great holiday season. There's my information if you want to reach out to me directly. Happy to field any questions and get any feedback. And we will see you in 2019. Until then, take care.